Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Basil Zimmerman. I'm the director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Geneva. And I'm one of the co-organizers with my colleague Blaise Dupuis of the Institute of Sociological Research. And we also have Maya Todeschini, who is not with us today, of the Department of East Asian Studies. So now we are already well into the series, but maybe just to repeat. So it's a one semester where the Institute of Sociological Research wanted to collaborate with scholars, local scholars who work on Asia, a lot of them on China actually, but some people on Korea or Japan or Philippines actually also, we could say, for the case of Justin. And today we are very happy to welcome Justin Veuthey for his research presentation. As Blaise mentioned quickly, it's a staff seminar, so it's very much a place for discussion and exchanges. However, sometimes it's recorded and then uploaded to YouTube. It's the case today. So for this reason, it's better not to ask questions during the presentation. Only the presentation is recorded. After the presentation, during the Q&A, it's not. So feel free to ask any question you want, but do not.
Sorry, could you speak up, please?
Yeah, okay. I was saying that the today's presentation is recorded. So it's not a good idea to ask questions during the presentation because it will interrupt our speaker. However, the Q&A after the presentation is not recorded, so we hope you can feel free to discuss without thinking that everything is archived in some sense. So our speaker today is Justin Veuthey. Justin is, I asked for his permission to mention that his family has been in Geneva for 5 generations. I like that because my family is a similar background, but between Swiss Germany and French part of Switzerland. And then I would say the two of us, we're the first generation who starts to move like really far away. So Justin did his he did his high school in Geneva, but then he moved to Canada. He has a bachelor in geography from McGill. Then he came back to Geneva. He did a master at the Graduate Institute. At that time, they had another name, but in development studies. Then he moved back to Canada again, did a PhD at the University of Montreal. He's a specialist of disaster prevention. And he also, after his PhD had field work in the Philippines, but afterwards he started to work for NGOs, international organizations, and some of his work and his personal work experience led him to be a visiting researcher at the University of Shandong. University of Shandong is one of the big Chinese university. Everybody knows them in China, but usually not here. I'm just mentioning this. And today he will speak about disaster prevention in China. We're also very lucky to have a high-profile discussant, Professor Claudio Beur, who is online, so you will see him on the screen later. Professor Claudio Beur has a background in engineering, but he also has many years, I heard 30 years of experience working, teaching in China, so it's going to be very interesting. Each presentation for this series of talks is the same, so we start with the presentation of our speaker, then we have a Q&A only between the discussant and the presenter, and then we open to the audience both online and offline. For those who are online, you can any moment you can write down your question in the chat, and we can write them down, and then we will mention them to the speaker. For those who are here, please just wait until the end after the discussion with the discussant, and then we can open up the debate. Okay, so I think I talked enough. Justin, the screen, the floor are yours.
Thank you very much, Basile. Welcome, everyone. Good morning for those of you who are joining us from North America, perhaps very early. Good afternoon, good evening for those in Asia. I know I have a few colleagues and friends who are joining us from China. And bon appétit. And for those of you who have brought your lunch for the déjeuner sociologique. I want to thank, of course, the Institut de Recherche Sociologique for giving me the opportunity to speak here today, as well as I want to underline my much heartfelt gratitude to Claudio Beur for agreeing to be my discussant. I just click down to check. So the plan for today's presentation. Fundamentally, I'm going to be asking the question of why we should care about what's going on in contemporary China. And one of the reasons why is that it's becoming an innovation powerhouse. And I'm going to try to explore that a little bit in the second part of this presentation. In the second part also, I want to underline how it is very dangerous for us in the West to not realize that China is both able and is innovating. Then I'm going to look a little bit more specifically in the domain of 5G telecommunications. And finally, I'm going to surveil, passer comme chat sur braise, but look at it a little bit about how these 5G technologies and technologies in general can be used for disasters or disaster prevention more specifically. So why should we care about China? I know some of you here have been in China or are Chinese recently. For those of you who have not been to China recently, what does 11/11 say to you? Does anyone have any idea what happened? What does this mean anything to you? Online, I can't see. Anyhow, so I'll give you a clue. Today is the 4th day of the 11th month. And so in China, next week, the 11th of November, is Singles Day. It's a huge deal. It is 4 times larger than Black Friday and Cyber Monday combined. It's a gigantic event. And it was invented in 2009, I believe, by the Alibaba Group as a marketing ploy. And today it is the world's largest retail event, both physically and online. And so this may seem like an anecdote, but I find it symptomatic how few people in the West realize what is going on in China. And I find this to be in my eyes, a telling example. When I came back from Shandong Dashui in 2020, I was surprised, not to say shocked, to see how little people outside of China and in the West in particular realized what was going on in China. So this graph here is gross domestic product, GDP per capita, and how much that GDP per capita has grown in the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2019. And so Zach Dichtwald came up with this interesting little way of showing how much things have changed in different countries. And so, we have Switzerland here, definitely under 5 times. But I mean, we're already quite a rich country. The United States as well, quite low increase in GDP per capita. In the US, I think it's in the last 30 years, it's 2.7 times greater GDP per capita. In China, it is 32 times larger. So this is a massive change in people's way of living, people's wealth, people's well-being. And as a result, China has lifted between 600 and 800 million people out of poverty. This graph here is from the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department, the DFA, and they came out with a report this year, and this graph is directly pulled from that. And so, some people say it's 600 million, other people say it's 800 million. This graph, this data here is from the World Bank, and they say 800 million. To give you a scale of things, that is that is the equivalent approximately of the entire European Union population with 27 member states of the EU today, times 2, raised out of poverty. And this gives the government in China significant legitimacy within China. Why should we care about what's going on in China? In part because our government thinks we should care about it. And in this strategy, the China strategy report from the Foreign Affairs Department of March of this year, they underline that China is Switzerland's 3rd largest trading partner after the EU and the US. There are many Swiss companies operating in China. And this report from the Foreign Affairs Department underlines how there's a dire need for knowledge and expertise about China within Switzerland. And that's both within government and within industry and society at large. And more importantly, for my own interests and for this talk, if you're interested in new technologies and you are not interested in China today, it is like if you were interested in cars in the 1950s, but you never looked at the United States. Furthermore, there's this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. And we can't really afford not to care about China. You know, China has invested $1.3 trillion in the BRI initiative. I don't deal in this kind of money very often, so let me underline that trillions are 12 zeros. That's a lot of money, and a lot of this money is going into infrastructure in the global south. This program was launched in 2013 by President Xi Jinping. As of January 2021, there are 140 countries which have memorandums of understandings, MOUs, with Beijing. 18 of these countries are in the European Union, including the Czech Republic and Greece. And in my opinion, almost more importantly, 40 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so where China is building roads, where China is building railways, where China is building seaports, they are also bringing with them massive investments in fiber optic cables and telecommunication standards. They are setting the standards for this incoming technology. The core of my argument is that the West needs to innovate its understanding of Chinese innovation. China is no longer a copycat, making crappy versions of carburetors for tractors. Those days are over. For example, in 2009, all of the top 10 internet companies were American. In 2019, 10 short years later, out of the top 10, 4 were Chinese already. In 2019, the US Defense Innovation Board is quoted as saying that a lot of these technologies, that these shifts in technologies have not just occurred because Chinese equipment is, quote, cheaper. In many cases, Chinese equipment is also of superior quality to its Western rivals. So for those of you who don't know what the DIB, the Defense Innovation Board is, it's a think tank for the US military of people who come out of Silicon Valley. It was founded by the likes of the long-term CEO of the Google Alphabet Group, Eric Schmidt. So these guys realized that China is innovating. And however, up until 2014, the folks at the Harvard Business Review didn't quite seem to catch that. And so there's this narrative ongoing, which says that, it's best expressed by William Bratton, who says that many critiques of China, quote, through the prism of it being a rigid command and control communist system doomed to follow its Soviet Union to eventual failure, thereby proving the superiority of the Western systems. And the entrenched expectations subsequently frame the way they instinctively and negatively interpret the actions of its government. It's dangerous for us to believe this narrative that China is inflexible and unable to make real innovation. This is the same review, Harvard Business Review, 7 short years later. It seems that some folks in some parties have started realizing that China is an innovation powerhouse. And why have they become an innovation powerhouse? There is no alternative, they used to say, for neoliberal policies. Well, it's kind of the same thing here. China doesn't really have a choice in the sense that if they don't innovate, they will be trapped in the middle income trap. The economy has risen, as I've underlined. Wages are increasing and cheap labor is no longer that much cheaper than in Indonesia or the Philippines, or for that matter, from certain states in the United States. Labor is pretty cheap in Alabama and so forth in the southern US. So the middle income trap has to be avoided. Also, demography. In China, it's estimated that the population has either peaked already or will peak in 2030. And that in 2030, there will be 81 million fewer people of working age. And that after 2030, there will be the equivalent of 7.6 million people less in the country because of population decrease. And again, for comparison, that's almost the entire population of Switzerland, 8.6 million per year, which are the decrease. And these figures here are figures which are given by China's own National Bureau of Statistics. So one way of measuring Chinese innovation is to look at how much it has increased in its scientific publications. And this here looks at the total amount of scientific articles published. And this is the same, the data for this is from the same source as the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department. I'm going to show 4 graphs here. This is all scientific articles combined. And you can see that at about 2019, China caught up with the US for all scientific articles. It's for engineering articles. So this is perhaps more the field of my discussant, Professor Claudio Boer. You can see that in 2007, they had overpassed the US in amount of articles they were publishing. Then for environmental science, perhaps that was less of a priority initially, but in 2016, they were also publishing more in environmental science than the US. And so you could say, they're publishing a lot, but it's just crap, right? It's the old narrative that the quality is not there. However, and this again is pulled right from the Foreign Affairs Department's report on China. This is how much Western scientific journals are quoting, from which countries they're quoting. And the trend here is pretty clear. Less and less from the US, more and more from China. If you look at the bottom line there, Switzerland quoting is slowly decreasing as well. But I mean, the point here is that China is producing a very high amount of high quality scientific research. One way this is being promoted and pushed by Chinese authorities is with the Made in China 2025 program. This was launched in 2015 by Xi Jinping. And the objective was for China to become, quote, a leading global technological superpower by 2049. So perhaps not everyone here knows what happens in 2049. It is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Following these announcements in 2015, this drew irritation from many capitals in the West, and subsequently, being diplomatically savvy, the Chinese authorities scrubbed and no longer referred to this plan, and also similar terms such as self-sufficiency rate have been taken out of official policy reports. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. It's still very much being promoted, being pushed, and they're investing significant amounts of money in research. They're investing in these 10 core industries where they want to become world leaders. And in some of these industries, aviation and space, for example, that is not quite the case yet. Definitely Boeing and Airbus still have the lead. And to this day, the engines and fighter jets of Chinese aircraft are still made in Russia. However, there are some industries like the energy equipment industry, like advanced rail equipment, like energy, like electrical vehicles, right? Today is the COP in Copenhagen and all this, right? All of this stuff, China is very clearly a leader. And specifically in the field of next generation IT. So, yeah, the Made in China 2025, MIC 25, is actually massive public funding for research. The figure we estimate for 2018 is 300 billion US dollars, which was the equivalent of 2.2% of the GDP. And for comparison, how is Europe doing? Europe is investing 2.1% of its gross domestic product back into research. The US is investing 0.7% of its GDP into research. So yes, the US still has a significantly, well, not that much significant, but like it still has a bigger GDP, but that's still quite low. And it used to be that the US was investing significantly more of its GDP into research. If you look at basic research, the US government now only spends approximately 0.2% of its GDP into basic research. And that is roughly the equivalent of what the US population spends on beer every year. In the Chinese system, state-owned enterprises definitely play a very key role in promoting this innovation. And all of these figures here are elusive because there are many different non-official ways to promote innovation: tax incentives, insurance compensations, as well as direct funding. One of the areas where China is very clearly in the lead is the very critical field of wireless telecommunication. So I realize that some of you have been reading in the news about Huawei and 5G and all sorts of things. I'm not going to delve too much into that in this presentation, but I will underline that the whole debate about 5G needs to be put into the context of geopolitics. What is 5G? 5G is the 5th generation of telecommunication networks. It means way more data at way more speed. It's estimated that it will be 20 times faster than the current 4G LTE. Back in the late 1990s, we started having internet access on our phones with 3G. That industry was led by Japan, and that cost the US economy quite a bit. Following this, for the 4G revolution or the 4G innovation, that was, the 4G generation was led by the United States, and because they had learned from the economic costs of not being a leader in industry. So what are the applications of 5G? 5G is all sorts of things. I mean, you could say that this massive amount of data at very high speeds will allow much more use of virtual and augmented reality. Does someone here in the audience, at least here I can see, know the difference between augmented and virtual reality? No, kind of, or you're shy. Anyhow, for the sake of, I'll keep on going. Virtual reality is when you have your mask on and you're playing video games and it's all imaginary world. Augmented reality is a fireman who is bursting into a burning building and he has goggles on and he can see where, he can see the map of the building he's in. He can have direct communication with people telling him there is someone stranded on the 3rd floor, et cetera, et cetera. So augmented reality, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the Google glasses and all of this stuff where they're working with Ray-Ban now. All of this stuff, it's coming. Whether we like it or not, it's coming. But fundamentally, 5G is not going to be about my phone or your phone or being able to download the latest Hollywood movie super fast. That doesn't matter. The real deal about 5G is the massive Internet of Things, IoT, the massive machine-to-machine communication that this massive amount of data at very high speeds will allow. So now, sometimes you can turn the speaker on in your living room with your phone. But I mean, you have to imagine that this will, with artificial intelligence, this technology is coming to us, and it's coming to us a lot faster than we may think. And as the Germans call it, the fourth industrial revolution, this will allow, we're not exactly sure what it will allow, but what's certain is that it has a potential to create smart cities. So we're talking about autonomous cars with all of its 5G sensors talking to the 5G sensors on the TPG public transport bus ahead of you, talking to the street light, talking to all the other cars in the city, all being processed with a massive algorithm and having you travel very efficiently and very fast, if it all works, right? This is always the question. Yes, it could work, it could be wonderful, but who knows? Smart industry, you have to imagine factories with a very high amount of machines talking to each other. What will be the space for human employees in that is another question. Smart agriculture, it's not so far off. And actually there are some people experimenting with that in some Swiss farms with each cow having 5G sensors, which gives up-to-date data of how the cow's doing, if it needs more grass, or if this stuff exists. This stuff is being experimented and it's coming out. This will also have repercussions on the military, which I don't know very much about, so I won't talk about. Just generally, a lot of these potentials are like talking about electricity in the 1880s. Some people were really excited about it and imagined it would be this wonderful future, but it wasn't really clear what it was going to be used for. So why is China in the lead when it comes to 5G? And this has to do with their choice of which part of the electromagnetic spectrum they want to focus on. And so on my right, on the right here, in the red, you have the mid bands, which are called the sub-6, and this was where Chinese industry has focused for 5G, as well as most of the rest of the world. The United States, which had been the leader in the 4G innovations, have chosen, or until recently, were focusing more on what is called millimeter waves. And so millimeter waves has lots of problems in the sense that it cannot go through the leaves of a tree. It doesn't go very well through walls. Sometimes if there's just rain, you won't get your millimeter wave connection. That's a major hurdle. So it would require a lot more antennas all over the place. So why on earth would the US choose to put their bets on millimeter waves? Well, this report from the Defense Innovation Board pointed out pretty clearly it's because sub-6 in the US is occupied by the Department of Defense, and the military until recently was not so keen on sharing this bandwidth. This is a map of tests done by Google in Los Angeles. It's the same pole, but just different antennas, the same spot, and it gives you an idea of the propagation, how much waves can travel through buildings and how much access you get, how well it goes, it's accessible. They call this a splat map for obvious reasons. And here again, you really see how the Chinese technology or the sub-6 technology works a lot better. Hello? Yep, hello, okay. No. Also, in terms of base stations, so base stations are the antennas fundamentally. And so when I was still in China in 2019, I had the pleasure of going to some launches of China Telecom's 5G push. And so here you have each little cube is 10,000 base stations. So you can see that in 2019, the US had 10,000 base stations. Oddly enough, they chose to, in this graph, to make it red. And in 2019, China had 130,000 antennas, base stations for 5G. Just 1 year later, and these are estimates, but it's believed that the US had 50,000 base stations in 5G, whereas China already had 690,000 in 2020. So China has rolled out 5G very fast, and the rest of the world is perhaps missing the boat. As of September of this year, just a month and a half ago, it's believed that there are about 1 million 5G antennas across China, that it covers most parts of the country, and that almost 400 million households are connected to 5G terminals. But as I said just a couple slides ago, it's not really about my 5G terminal and being able to download my thing super fast. That doesn't matter. That it's really about the massive machine-to-machine communication and Internet of Things, which this will allow. There's this thing in industry called the first mover advantage. So, the first country to set the standards, like the US did for 4G, they cash in because their companies, and they set the standards, and their companies, they also create the companies which will make use of this industry. And so this is how Uber and Netflix and a lot of these contemporary mastodons were created. It's thanks to the US's investment in innovation into 4G. And yeah, this is particularly the case for wireless communication because you set the specifications and the critical infrastructure to certain specifications. And as I said before, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, is building roads and railways and ports and all sorts of things all over the world. And those places are with Chinese fiber optic cables and Chinese standards. So the question is, or we should have, is, should we be having Torschlusspanik, fear of missing out, or something like that? Because all of this is happening within a geopolitical context. Again, if today we're talking, I have some colleagues who talk extensively about 5G and they never mention China. And I think this is it would be the same as talking extensively in the 1960s about satellite technology and never mentioning the space race between the US and the USSR. So I was told that perhaps I had to explain what Sputnik was. So in 1957, for those of you who didn't know, the Soviets sent the first satellite into space. And that really freaked out the Americans and the West in general. As a result, they invested massively in research and NASA and so forth, what we know. But so, we should be having our Sputnik moment in the West. So I'm coming here to the last part of my presentation. What does all of this have to do? Ooh, there's someone who needs to be let in still. Oh, thank you. So what does all of this have to do with disasters? All of this is being sorted out. It's like that just across the lake at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, protocols are being figured out, applications are being figured out. And fundamentally, we are at the state like in 1880, where we can wonder, in 1850, there was no electricity in the world hospitals. In 1880, electricity started becoming available. Did they know exactly what they were going to use it for? No, but similarly with the internet, in 1990, lots of people were saying, why are you bothering us with the internet, right? We have great fax machines. What are you pestering us with this internet story? Today, could you imagine a hospital without electricity? Could you imagine a hospital without the internet? I think in a not so distant future, we will be asking ourselves, can you imagine yourself a hospital without 5G, Internet of Things, telecommunication? In disaster studies, one of the essential equations of the last 30 years or so is the fact that the risk of a disaster is a combination of the natural hazard, which can be natural or can be man-made, or you could argue climate change is kind of both, but ooh, there's somebody else trying to poke in. Yeah. And so that the risk equation is the hazard, which can be natural, combined with vulnerability. And vulnerability is what human beings can do. And there's lots of things that individuals can do and that governments can do to reduce their vulnerability. We can choose not to build hospitals in floodplains. Or in a more Swiss fashion, we can choose not to make our chalets in valleys what we know that every winter have avalanches. There's lots of things that governments can do to prevent that, to reduce our vulnerability. More specifically in China, China is very highly exposed to natural hazards. Almost every province has an exposure to earthquakes. There are about 7 typhoons per year. And in 2008, China had a real rude awakening with the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, which killed about 70,000 people. In disaster studies, as much as we are sorry for the number of people who died, we are also quite concerned for all of the other people who are injured. And so it's multiplied by 5 usually. So lots of people were injured, affected. It was particularly dramatic for the legitimacy of the Chinese government, because about 7,000 schools in Sichuan crumbled during this earthquake because they were not built up to right building standards or with the proper material. The engineers were good. They knew what they were supposed to be doing, but the material and the building plans had not been followed. Why is this? So there's been massive investment since then to make sure, within China, to make sure this doesn't happen again. And this is really a question for them for the legitimacy of their government. In 2019 and 20, when the pandemic started, or the epidemic at the time started breaking out, there were some applications of 5G. For example, in Wuhan hospitals, robots using 5G communication were monitoring body temperatures, heart rates, blood oxygen levels, and so forth. So thus not exposing nurses and promoting the expansion of the pandemic. Similarly, in many schools of the same province, in Hubei province, actually Hubei, the schools used infrared cameras to make sure that there were no additional clusters. Similarly, so 5G, as well as drones, where China is also very much a leader. Perhaps some of you have cousins or kids who fly a drone, or you've seen them in the park. Most of the drones you see are DJI, which is based out of Shenzhen, and which covers 70% of the global drone consumer market. And drones can be super useful for disasters, whether it's very early detection of fires, or making maps very fast, or for example, in this map here, this is a project that Huawei has, where they're using drones with thermal sensors to have very early detection of fires. So they can have, usually if you're just having cameras or people flying above, you can see when there's smoke, but then that's above the canopy. So this allows very early detection when it's perhaps possible to turn these fires off. And it's a lot cheaper and a lot safer than using helicopters. More generally, all of these applications of these innovations and 5G are very much being worked out today. Like all of these conferences are in the last 6 months, or papers have been coming out in the last 6 months, whether it's the International Telecommunications Union or different branches of the United Nations. All this to say that society at large needs to be aware, and social scientists in particularly need to follow this stuff because it's going to have major impacts. And Geneva in particular, where a lot of these decisions are being made and a lot of new legislation is being applied, needs to be paying attention. I do want to end with a brief anecdote that new tech can actually very much increase our vulnerability. So back in October of 2019 in Northern California, over 700 cell phone towers went out of power. So over 700 cell phone towers were no longer usable. And this stranded huge portions of the Northern California population. They couldn't communicate with their family or authorities, or get the news, or figure out whether they should stay in place or try to evacuate. Globally, we have all become extremely dependent on our cell phones, and that is not always a good thing. And the place which was most affected in this particular fire is Marin County, where over 60% of the towers were no longer functioning. And I use this as an anecdote and as an example because this is like the cutting edge part of the US, the Bay Area, where they were so stranded. And so my main point here is that as excited as I am about 5G and innovations, I think we as societies must be wary of becoming overly reliant on technologies. So here's my conclusion. A lot of this innovation and 5G in particular are happening within a geopolitical context. When you're listening at the different narratives, you need to bear in mind that there are geopolitics behind what's being said. One of the main take-home messages I hope I bring you is that 5G is not about your phone and my phone. It'd be great to have really quick movies and stuff, but it's not about that. It's about the Internet of Things. It's about massive communication between machines, which is happening, and it's very close to us. And we may not like it. It may be like teenage pregnancy or teenage sex. Maybe we don't like to think about it, but it's happening, and 5G is happening. So we better get educated. We better get educated. The risk equation, that the risk of a disaster is a combination of a hazard with vulnerability, and that there are many things that human societies, individuals, and governments can do to reduce their vulnerability. And finally, next week or on November 11th, I hope you have a kind thought and a kind word for your friends who may not be in a relationship. So that was the end of my presentation. Here I have a QR code for LinkedIn, which I'm quite a fan of, and a QR code for WeChat, which if you don't use WeChat, I encourage you to try it out. It's really cool. So that was it for my presentation. Thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Very much, Justin. I'm moving here because we have quite a lot of people online, 30, I think, something like that. So we will now have the discussion between our discussants and the presenter. I feel like adding a sentence from the Confucius Institute side, as the Confucius Institute is a platform for exchange between China and the West. So our mission is to remain neutral and not to take stance. So I'm always like focusing on that. But if I try to put in context, based on my experience, I have 20 years of experience of exchange between Switzerland and China. Justin is, for me, very representative of people from here going to China, stay a while, come back, and you have this message: wake up, people. If I can say, yeah. I think this is a very something we see repeatedly. So it's a good example of that. Now you can still think what you want about this, and I look forward to our discussions since he has many years of experience between Switzerland and China as well. So it's going to be an interesting